Good afternoon to everyone, and a very warm welcome to the RSIS webinar with Dr. Adam Garfinkel on US Korea Policy, the Persistence of Failure. I'm Sarah Teo, and I will be your moderator for this session. So before we start the session proper, I would just like to bring a few housekeeping notice to your attention. So first, for participants, you are encouraged to switch your view to the speaker view in Zoom instead of the gallery view, so that your screen will be focused on the speaker. Secondly, the question and answer session will be conducted through the chat icon in Zoom. You will find this icon at the bottom of your computer screen. So if you have questions for the speaker, please post your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out during the Q&A session. I would ask that you state your name, if not already visible, your institutional affiliation, and please keep your questions short and concise. Finally, do note that inappropriate comments may result in participants being removed from the event and barred from re-entry thereafter. So on that cheerful note, I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Adam Garfinkel, who is on a year-long engagement at RSIS as our distinguished visiting fellow. Aside from being founding editor of The American Interest, Dr. Garfinkel has served as editor of The National Interest, as well as principal speechwriter to the US Secretary of State. Without further ado, I'm pleased to now pass the time to Dr. Garfinkel. Adam, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Teo. And it is very nice to be able to say Dr. Sarah Teo. So this is the last of a series of Singapore-based webinars that I'll be presenting. My wife and I are wheels up back to the United States on Wednesday. There will be more, however. There will be, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 more of these between now and the end of the calendar year from Washington, D.C. I like to tell you that I look forward to them, but I actually don't. And I just want you to know that Zoomland is not a great place for someone who's giving a talk. It may be okay for somebody who's listening to one, and I've listened to many, but for someone who's actually doing the presentation, it's a little bit of an unnatural act because I don't know who's out there. I don't know who the audience is. And you know, when I tell a joke or say something witty, if it were a normal face-to-face situation, you could hear people laugh. You could get a feel for the audience, you know, but I can't see, feel, or hear anything in a situation like this. So it's kind of weird, but it's a weird time, we all know. And so we do just the best we can. Before I start into the substance of this, since this is the last Singapore-based of the webinars I've done, I think I've done 5 or 6, I don't even remember. I'd like to thank the RSIS staff, the technical staff and the substantive staff for being so competent, such good friends all along. And I'd like to mention Bilateral Kausikan, who, through whose auspices I am in Singapore in the first place. And if it wasn't for Bilateral, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be doing this and you wouldn't be hearing me. So if you like anything you've heard or hear today, thank Bilateral for it. Also, Ong Keng Young, the head of RSIS, same thing, and in spades. If without his support and help, you wouldn't be watching this right now because I wouldn't be here. So again, I'm very grateful for all the support and all the friends and all the help I've had at RSIS and in Singapore all year. It's been quite wonderful. Now let's talk a little bit about Korea, and I have a couple of preliminary remarks because I don't want to claim more than is reasonable. I am not an expert on Korea. I've only been there once, and I've never been to North Korea, though I'd like to go. I'm no expert on Korea or on East Asia. But on the other hand, as the current president has said, once in a while he says something that isn't false or isn't an outright lie. As our current president has said, the experts over the years on Korea have not exactly showered themselves with glory. In fact, the title of this talk sort of suggests that American policy toward Korea, going back for quite a while, has been a series of, if not failures, in fact, there's actually 1 or 2 really signal successes in the policy, but there certainly has been a lot of inadvertency or fits of absent-mindedness and sometimes outright errors and failure when it comes to Korea policy. The error rate of American foreign policy is in general large for a great power. We can afford large error rates because we are blessed with a geopolitical circumstance unlike that of any great power in history. As Mackinder said, we are a world island. We have a friendly neighbor to our north in Canada. We have a somewhat weak and feckless ally to our south in Mexico. And on our eastern and western sides, we have a lot of fish. And there's never been a great power in history with such a benign geopolitical circumstance. We could afford, I'm not saying we we ought to pursue error rates like the kind we've piled up, but we can afford them and survive. Whereas most other great powers who are locked cheek by jowl in somewhere in Eurasia or elsewhere really can't afford those kinds of error rates and survive. But Korea has been a case in point of just mistakes after mistakes, inadvertencies, fits of absent-mindedness, one after the other. And we're still here, and so is Korea. So just goes to show you. I'd like to suggest, however, that even though I'm not an expert on Korea, sometimes an unorthodox approach to a problem can be useful. It's the same, when you're trying to see a relatively dim star in the night sky. Sometimes an astronomer will tell you that it's easier to see a dim star in the night sky through your peripheral vision than by looking straight at it. And we also know from the history of science that sometimes breakthrough insights in sciences are not made by people who are inured to the orthodoxies of a particular academic discipline, but somebody who comes at a problem from an orthogonal point of view. So I'm hoping that what I have to say here, even though it certainly will disturb the true experts on the subject, and stuff I've written on this over the years has disturbed some good friends of mine who are experts on the subject. I still hope that I'll have something creative or at least thought-provoking to say, because I really do believe that sometimes in this line of work, it's better to be interestingly wrong about something and start a good conversation as a result of it than to be, trivially correct about something, but say nothing that generates any kind of interest or thought. So this is a thought experiment. And I'm going to give you a line of argument about Korea after a little bit of history, and it's a thought experiment because I want to tell you right now that what I suggest the United States do with respect to policy toward Korea, I know isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon. It might not happen at all ever. So it really is a thought experiment. And the hope that I have is that it'll help people think anew about the zugzwang, the locked, frozen circumstance that US policy is in and has been in for a number of years, because the problem with North Korea and the problem, notably with the nuclear weapons developments of recent times, is that this problem just keeps getting worse. It doesn't get solved. It just keeps getting worse. And there's no end in sight to just how bad it could possibly get. We don't know where the bottom is of this problem. And that makes it kind of anxiety producing. But that said, so I think we need some new thinking about it, some different thinking about it. But just remember, this is a thought experiment, right? I know that what I'm proposing is very unlikely to happen. So I do think it would be useful to review a little bit of the history. If we tried to do anything serious about it, we'd be here all through the weekend, so we can't do that. But I think it's worthwhile to show how the tenured experts on this part of the world, and Korea in particular, going back really to the end of the Second World War, have approached the question from an unusually casual point of view. I want to just give you, I want to give you words carefully chosen here, and so I'm not going to use my own. I'm going to use words by my friend Mike Green, who really is an expert on this part of the world, Japan in particular, but really the whole East Asia zone. My friend Mike Green, who's written a terrific book on this that is absolutely indispensable if you want to understand American thinking historically and right to the present day, really. If you want to understand American thinking about Korea and about Northeast Asia and about Asia and the whole continent. So I'm going to read just an excerpt. Turns out it's from page 233 of this book. And as I'm doing it, Miss Lang, if you could show the cover of the book for anybody who would like to note it down so that you might get it. So here's what Michael writes on page 233. Japan's original colonies of Korea and Formosa were not to be treated the same as French and British colonies, of course. And we're talking here about 1944, 1943, 44, 45, toward the end of the Second World War. At Cairo Conference, 1943, Roosevelt promised to return Formosa to China, and the island eventually became the refuge for Chiang and the nationalists after the victory of Mao and the CCP in 1949, as I'm sure everybody here in this audience knows. Korea, it was generally agreed at Potsdam, that's 1945, would be jointly occupied in anticipation of an eventual trusteeship. That was promised at Cairo a little earlier. And presumably from the American perspective, democratic elections and self-determination would result from that trusteeship. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria in the final weeks of the war, right, forced what then Lieutenant Colonel and future Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Dean Rusk, who you remember was Secretary of State during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. What Dean Rusk called, and I'm quoting Rusk now from the archives, his 10-second extemporaneous decision, 10-second extemporaneous decision, close quote, to divide Korea at the 38th parallel before notifying the War Department Joint War Plans Committee. So Rusk just did this on the fly, basically. With Soviet forces past the Yalu and Tumen rivers, the Americans were pleasantly surprised, Michael Green again writing, we were pleasantly surprised to find that Stalin agreed to halt his occupation at the 38th parallel. And I can, if you want in questions, I can explain to you why we think Stalin agreed. Nevertheless, and here's the kicker, post-war planning for Korea had taken little account of exactly when or how the Korean people would establish democratic institutions and self-rule. It is revealing in the vast SWNCC files. SWNCC means, it's an acronym, you know, Americans love acronyms. It means State War Navy Coordinating Committee. That's what the organization that put together the military and the diplomatic pieces of American policy during the Second World War was called, the SWNCC, State War Navy Coordinating Committee. There are no files, there are no folders pertaining to Korea. Nothing, not one. Indeed, it is a remarkable omission given Korea's history as the cockpit of Asia and the central role the peninsula would soon play in the Cold War. That's what Michael has to say. And I think that sums up the history of the end of the Second World War pretty well. Of course, it doesn't stop there in terms of inadvertencies and fits of absent-mindedness and difficulties. I think everyone listening knows something about how the Korean War began. One of the elements of how the Korean War began just a few years later was a famous press conference by then Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who, in front of a map at the National Press Club, defined the perimeter of U.S. defense concerns in Asia, and he left out South Korea. And a lot of people thought then, and I think still think now, that by leaving it out, he inadvertently signaled Kim Jong-il and Stalin that if North Korea, with Soviet support, invaded South Korea, the United States and its allies would do nothing about it. Of course, when that invasion, in fact, took place in June of 1950, that wasn't the conclusion that the United States reached. We did do something about it. We went to war over it, and more than 50,000 Americans died in that war. I'm not going to call the Korean War a mistake. It's too complicated to even ask the question and answer it in a short time. But looking at it from now, I mean, you could probably argue that war was quite gratuitous. It did, however, have one inadvertent effect, and this is something that everybody needs to understand about this business. Sometimes effects are intended and they're either good or bad. Sometimes they're unintended and they're either good or bad. One of the things that the Korean War caused was the militarization of NSC 68. When Paul Nitze wrote, the document that defined American strategy for the Cold War, NSC 68, there was not enough money in the Truman administration, and very little was going to be forthcoming to actually put teeth behind that document. It was the Korean War that militarized U.S. Cold War policy, for better or for worse. George Kennan thought it was for worse. in the long run, I'm not so sure Kennan was correct about that. But nobody expected that the Korean War would have that impact, but that's the impact that it actually had. When a Secretary of State stands in front of a map and tells you and lists specific places that the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense considers to be within the U.S. defense perimeter, right? It invariably results in not mentioning some places that are then presumed to be not inside the U.S. defense perimeter. Why am I mentioning this? Why is this important now? Because on July 13th, some of you will remember, the current Secretary of State made a couple of remarks, fairly formal remarks about the South China Sea and about Chinese claims to a number of islands in the region, some of which are claimed by Japan, some of which are claimed by Indonesia, some of which are claimed by the Philippines, some of which are claimed by Vietnam. And he did the same thing. He specifically mentioned a series of shoals and rocks and reefs and so forth. And again, you have to worry when people do that, because he must have missed naming something. There's got to be some rock out there that he didn't mention. And I would be upset if anybody in Beijing or anywhere else took that to mean that anything that he didn't mention is fair game. That could be quite accident prone. I don't like it when secretaries of state, give geography lessons. It makes me nervous. In any event, to get back to the theme here, there are three basic lessons I think we can take from the history. Going back even before 1944-45, when you look at the history of American thinking about East Asia, Asia in general, but including Korea, you go back to the origins of this. It goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan and Theodore Roosevelt in the years after the Spanish-American War, so the beginning of the 20th century. Pretty much an agreement across the board that it would be a bad idea for the United States to put troops, even semi-permanently, on the Asian mainland. That this was a bad idea. Mahan's view, he was a navalist. He studied British strategy and history. And as far as Mahan and Roosevelt were concerned, the United States was a world island. It was a maritime power. It was, in those days, given the relative balance of forces in the Pacific and elsewhere, an offshore balancing kind of power, believed to be able to serve American interest at that point, given the technology of the times. And the idea of putting ground forces on the mainland for any length of time was considered a very bad idea. I don't want to go into the reasons. Most of them are pretty obvious. Even after the Spanish-American War, even the extension of U.S. rule to the Philippines, all right, not exactly on the mainland, but pretty darn close, even Theodore Roosevelt, who was not a shy, retiring violent about the extension of American power and American force, realized pretty soon what a mistake that was. And of course, we found out in December 1941, in fact, what a huge mistake the U.S. occupation of the Philippines turned out to be. And of course, this theme resonates. This theme, don't put U.S. troops on the mainland and don't fight a war on the Asian mainland. This warning resonates through American history, through American military history, diplomatic history, for years and years and years. Toward the end of the Second World War, if you look at the planning documents of this committee that I mentioned, State-Borne Navy Coordinating Committee, there are a couple lines in the archives. Somebody had this idea that the United States, at that point, 1943-44, not being sure about how the war with Japan would end or when it would end, actually considered the idea of seizing Formosa, today called Taiwan, for the United States. Why? Because it was an island. It wasn't on the mainland. Of course, that never happened, thank goodness. But people actually thought about that stuff, and they thought about it in the context of this history that waved off or warned off the idea of a permanent American presence on the Asian mainland. And you see this after the war, after World War II, when policy planning in the Department of State was set up, and George Kennan was its first director. And if you go back and you look at the papers, you see this theme again: do not put troops on the Asian mainland. And even after that, well, in one case before the Korean War began, but in another case during it and just after, when official U.S. alliance relationships were negotiated with the Republic of Korea and with the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan, the United States government, in the first case, in the Korean case, and then later in the case of Taiwan, insisted in the diplomacy, and this was arduous diplomacy that took a long time to work out an agreement, that under no circumstances would the United States be bound to defend South Korea or to defend Taiwan if either one of those countries took an initiative to start a war. Right? In the South Korean case, a war with North Korea, or in the Taiwanese case, a war with China. The United States, in other words, wanted a guarantee from these new allies that it would not be dragged into a war with a major power against its will. We would not be chain ganged into a war. Again, you see the same caution about getting involved in a war or a relatively permanent troop presence on the Asian mainland, running through everything the United States did with respect to Asia in these years. And so what happens as a result of the Korean War, which the United States decided to oppose the North Korean invasion, we end up, not by plan, but really quite inadvertently, with a US troop presence in South Korea. And of course, it's still there. There are 38,000 US soldiers roughly in South Korea, and it's still there after all these years. And I mean, just to race ahead to the sort of the base of the real point I want to try to make, the fact that American soldiers ended up pretty much permanently, for quite a long time, from 1950 through yesterday morning, the last time I looked, in South Korea, it didn't turn out to be a disaster. There hasn't been another war. There hasn't been an invasion. Right? There's been a lot of tension, and that was true even before the North Korean nuclear program really got legs. And actually, this was the major success the United States had in Korea was completely inadvertent. Korea became divided between a pro-Western U.S. alliance included partner with a market economy, contrasted with the command economy and the Soviet bloc participation of North Korea. All right. Creating an analogy in Asia to the situation in the middle of Europe with Germany, where you had the Bonn Republic, the FRG, on one hand, and the DDR, the East Germany, on the other. And the contrast over the years, as time went on, the contrast could not be missed by anybody with eyes wide open. My wife went through the Brandenburg tour in 1971, moving from West Berlin to East Berlin, and she described it as going from color TV to black and white. And if you look at the difference between South Korea and North Korea today, you couldn't add, in the case of divided Germany and divided Korea, you could hardly ask for a more vivid description of what a market-based democracy leads to in terms of prosperity and security and sort of general way of life, as contrasted with a communist, Leninist command economy arrangement. I mean, how can anybody not see this? So that was a success, and the eventual development of Korean democracy, same thing in Taiwan, and the prosperity that both of these countries have achieved has to be, along with Japan, of course, has to be marked as a major success of U.S. Cold War policy. It vindicated the matching of the security relationships with the pro-democracy and human rights aspects of the policy, with the economic, with the trade and economic prosperity aspects of the policy. It took a long time for these developments to work through, but they did work through. But again, I mean, the irony here, and history is irony in motion, said a Romanian philosopher once, is that this was completely inadvertent. I mean, it's not like somebody said in 1945 or 1948, or actually, the Sunday morning before the North Korean invasion of South Korea, that this was going to be American post-war. These were American post-war ambitions and plans with regard to South Korea. Not at all. It was completely accidental, totally inadvertent. And that's just something you have to get used to when you're dealing with this kind of subject. The reluctance to keep troops in South Korea after they were there, after the Korean War was long since over. Of course, the war's not over. We have an armistice, as everybody knows. The war's not technically over. It continued on. In 1968, not a great year in the United States, a little like now, a man who was then Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia in the Defense Department, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Mort Abramowitsch, who happens to be a friend of mine whom I know, wrote a paper in 1968 for the Assistant Secretary, whose name was Nicholas Katzenbach, advocating U.S. withdrawal of ground forces from South Korea. And he just like Kennan did in 1947, he quoted Kennan from 1947, and as Kennan had quoted Mahan, so did Mort Abramowitsch. So again, this theme really runs through. Now, of course, things changed, and when things changed, people changed their minds about what the smart thing to do was. What changed, for example, between 1968, when Mort Abramowitsch wrote that paper suggesting the withdrawal of U.S. ground forces from South Korea. And 1977, 76, 77, during the campaign when Jimmy Carter was running against Gerald Ford, Carter had said during the campaign that he wanted to withdraw U.S. forces from South Korea. And just about everybody objected to this. The military objected. Smart diplomats objected. Why did Morton Abramowitz, same person, and Holbrooke, why did they object to this idea in 1977 when they were for it in 1968? Well, a lot had changed. I mean, two things had changed in particular. In 1968, South Vietnam had not fallen. Saigon had not fallen, and the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China had not yet really opened up. By 1977, on the other hand, all right, that was 2 years after the fall of Saigon to North Vietnam, and the relationship with China was just 1 year shy of being formalized. It was formalized. Formal diplomatic relations were opened in 1978 by the Carter administration. So at that point, after the fall of Saigon, the credibility of U.S. alliances generally in Asia was at issue. The nadir of American military credibility and actual force in the region had caused a kind of I don't know, a little bit of a lack of confidence in American promises and power in the region. And so the idea of unilaterally withdrawing the Korean the U.S. presence, the ground presence in South Korea struck serious diplomats at the time as like a really bad idea. And I remember this well because I'm old. It was a really bad idea. And there was a general named John Singlaub who actually went public, as military officers are not supposed to do in the civil military compact that we have in the United States, and really made a huge stink about it. This was like the first real, melodrama of the Carter administration. A lot of people who were around then remember it quite well, but that's what had changed. And you see, to me, the fact that somebody like Morton Abramowitz and Richard Holbrooke changed their minds because something had changed in the world, I mean, that's my problem now. There are two things that have changed. Two big things have changed in the past, 20 some years. And yet the Korea policy, the premises of US Korea policy have remained the same. The first thing that changed, everybody knows, is the end of the Cold War. Why does this matter? Okay, the Cold War comes to an end in 1991. Moreover, China, over the years, thanks to Deng Xiaoping and thereafter, China's no longer a Marxist country. It's more of a frenemy. I mean, the United States and China cooperated against the Soviet Union after the breakthrough in 1972, to one extent or another, with what consequences we can debate later on if you want. So during the Cold War, every conflict point, every possible hot point was seamless with respect to the reputation of the protagonists, both on the Soviet side and on the United States side. So anything that would happen in Korea would have echoes and reverberations in Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere. After the end of the Cold War, that seamlessness of the reputational capital of the United States was no longer the same. There was as I say, a great success of Korea policy generally in the United States. The end of the Cold War, could have allowed the United States to say, look, we won. I mean, that was a really, look at Korea, where policy was a success. Now let's rethink, what's changed as a result of the fact that it's no longer part of a seamless conflict between the Soviet bloc and the US bloc. That never happened. That zero-based reassessment of what the end of the Cold War meant for East Asia never happened. It might have happened had the Bush 41 administration been reelected in 1992, but it wasn't reelected, and that zero-based reassessment never happened. At least to the best of my knowledge, it never happened. The second thing that's changed with respect to Korea policy is the advance of the North Korean nuclear program. The fact that it's not possible now, it's likely to become possible reasonably soon, that a North Korean missile carrying a nuclear warhead can hit CONUS. CONUS is what we in the United States, as another acronym, another abbreviation. CONUS means the continental United States. All right. Right, for years, for all the time U.S. troops were in South Korea, have been in South Korea, it has not been possible for North Korean military to directly strike the United States. The United States could directly strike North Korea, but the reciprocal capability did not exist. They could not reciprocally strike the United States. That appears to be changing if it hasn't already changed. That makes a difference. That clearly makes a difference. And yet the policy continues on as if it never happened. And I just find this astonishing that people are not, John Maynard Keynes once famously said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And I have the same question for, for my colleagues in the United States who are Asia experts and who are Korea experts. Well, the facts have changed. Cold War is over, and North Korea can soon, if it can't already, hit CONUS with a nuclear weapon. The facts have changed. What do you do? Well, I've changed my mind about some things as a result of that, and I keep trying to persuade my colleagues that we should think about this differently. I haven't gotten very far, I have to admit. That's why this is a thought experiment, because this will never happen. Okay, so look where we are now, and I'm checking the time. Look where we are now with respect to the policy. So the history is so labyrinthian. So during the Clinton administration, 1993, 94, it became pretty clear at that point that the North Koreans were making some pretty serious progress on their nuclear program, and they had a reactor at Yongbyon, and there was a possibility that they were gonna take out the rods and they were gonna process plutonium to make bombs, and they were working on their missile program all along with help from various other quarters, and this began to become a real concern in the Defense Department and in the U.S. government. The Clinton administration discussed in excruciating detail exactly how the United States and its allies might respond to these changes in North Korean capabilities with respect to a nuclear weapons program, and it was a difficult time. Everybody knows that the North Koreans have a range of artillery aligned along the 38th parallel, and that Seoul, the capital of South Korea, is within range of this artillery. And as far as anybody knows, there's no sure shot way to disable in a preemptive strike that artillery. There's no way to protect those civilians in South Korea from a North Korean attack. So what has developed over the years, and again, I'm summarizing here a lot, I have to. What has developed is an in together, out together understanding between the United States and South Korea with respect to the defense of the country. So what this really means in practice is that if the United States wants to do anything militarily with respect to North Korea, it needs essentially the assent of the South Korean government to do it. The South Korean government has, in effect, not formally, but in effect, the South Korean government has a veto over pretty much anything short than extremist conditions, right? Has a veto over American military activity with respect to North Korea. So when things got really, really crisis rich in 1994, and the United States considered the possibility of a strike on North Korean facilities, and issued sanctions, threatened sanctions with North Korea, so forth. We all remember what happened. Most of us who were alive and adults at the time remember what happened. Out of nowhere, pretty much somewhere in Georgia, Jimmy Carter shows up in North Korea and announces to the President Clinton and the rest that he has a deal with the North Koreans that would result in their denuclearization in return for the lifting of the sanctions and a series of other adjustments, shall we say, to U.S. policy toward North Korea. This surprised the hell out of the Clinton administration. Carter had been invited to North Korea previously, but other administrations had persuaded him not to go. In this case, Carter decided just to do it anyway without asking, because he was persuaded that if he didn't go, there would be a war, and that this would be a bad thing. So Carter went, and the Clinton administration found itself. It's like Deus ex machina. I mean, here's this former president shows up in Pyongyang, negotiates this framework, and what is the Clinton administration supposed to do, right? Well, it kind of reminds me in a way of I don't know if you've seen this sort of the sitcom Crash Landing on You. It's a sitcom about North Korea. Well, when I first saw the sitcom, I thought about Jimmy Carter crash landing on Bill Clinton back in 1994. But anyway, the long and the short of it was that the agreed framework came into existence, and former President Carter made all kinds of promises about the integrity and the honesty of the North Korean regime at the time, and Carter thought he'd save the world, basically. We know now from defectors and from other means that the North Koreans were just buying time to build up their program, and they never intended to honor their agreement, and they didn't honor their agreement. They started to cheat on it almost from the moment the ink was dry, sort of the next chapter in the story, flips basically to 2002. So the North Koreans are working on their missiles, and they're working on all kinds of engineering problems. They're trying to build up, their infrastructure for a nuclear program. In 2002, so we're already past 9/11, we're already into the Bush 43 administration. In 2002, the United States discovers through, let's say, just call it national technical means. That's the phrase. We discovered that while the Yongbong reactor was not running at tilt, okay, the North Koreans had created a uranium enrichment program on the side, a secret uranium enrichment program on the side. And the United States basically had discovered that this program existed, got a pretty good feel for its extent and how long it had been going on and for what it had achieved, took some photographs of it from the sky. You can take some amazing photographs from satellites in the sky, in case you were unaware, and confronted, this was in 1993, I believe, no, 2002, 2003, confronted the North Koreans with the evidence that they were cheating. And of course, don't forget, the North Koreans did sign the NPT. I believe it was 1985. So they were in breach of their international obligations. They weren't just cheating, they were in breach of the NPT. So what happened in 2002, 2003? President Bush sent Jim Kelly, who was the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, he sent him to Pyongyang to confront the North Koreans about what they were doing with their enriched uranium program. And I was about to be in the administration at the time, right? Just a speechwriter, nobody important, right? Just writing speeches from the 7th floor of the State Department. But you hear things on the 7th floor, you talk to people. Anyway, I was there, and people expected that when Assistant Secretary Kelly read the North Koreans the Riot Act, they would deny that there was a uranium enrichment program. And to the surprise of Jim Kelly and the administration, and by the way, Michael Green, who was with Assistant Secretary Kelly on that trip, the North Koreans did not deny. They did not deny the uranium enrichment program. Instead, what they said to the American delegation was that first they threatened them. It threatened us and said, "We have lots of big bombs, and we're going to make more big bombs. We're going to go back to Yongbang. We're going to take the plutonium, the rods out, and extract the plutonium, and we're going to continue with the uranium enrichment program. We're going to make lots and lots of bombs, and we're going to keep working on our missile program. And by the way, if you want to stop us, here's what you have to do." And this is what the North Koreans told us. They basically said, "Okay, you have to remove all the sanctions, your own sanctions and the UN-related sanctions. You have to remove all the sanctions." And then they said, "You also have to withdraw the US nuclear security umbrella from South Korea and Japan. If you do that, then we can talk more about our North Korean program, whether it's plutonium extraction or uranium enrichment. You do those things, right? You take your nuclear shield away from Japan and South Korea, and then we can talk." So Jim Kelly got up and walked out of the room, which at that point was the right thing to do. So this was a problem. This clearly was a problem. So what happens next? Just in a nutshell, and this is where I have my cameo, right? What happens next is Secretary Powell goes to Beijing, because the idea was, obviously, given that trip that Jim Kelly took to Pyongyang, we were not going to get very far with the North Koreans. That was the view. We weren't going to get too far with that. The idea was maybe we can talk with the Chinese about this, and maybe the Chinese indirectly can exert some sort of pressure or reason on North Korea. And the idea was, the Chinese supply a lot of things that the Koreans need, sometimes food, sometimes energy. And by the way, I forgot to mention, as a part of the agreed framework, the United States agreed to supply light water reactors, kind of nuclear weapons proof light water reactors to North Korea. So every time the North Koreans do things like this, it basically comes down to a form of extortion, right? Either you do these things for us, give us food, give us energy, give us light water reactors, or we'll act like a madman and threaten to blow up the area, Well, that works. That's worked pretty well. So since it's worked pretty well for the North Koreans, now under Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, now since it works, they keep doing it. everybody does what works, so they keep doing it. This is a bad situation. The United States decides at a certain point that this is just not going to continue, right? So we lean on the Chinese and try to get the Chinese to help us deal with the problem. We figure it's China's problem too. You know, do the Chinese really want to live right next door to a North Korean regime that acts this way? Aren't there Chinese equities involved here as well? We thought maybe there was some basis for a limited cooperation between the United States and China with respect to Korea. So this was the tack that we wanted to take. So Powell goes to Beijing to talk about this, and what we want to do, what we're saying that we want to do, is we want to multilateralize our diplomacy with respect to North Korea. We want to bring in the neighbors. Now, I'm very familiar with this argument because in 2002, before I joined the Bush administration, I had written an article in the New Republic, which was, you know, at that time, a pretty well-respected policy magazine. And my argument was, at the time, and again, I wasn't a Korea expert then any more than I am now, but my idea was, look, there's some kinds of problems in life and in sports and in international diplomacy that can't be solved bilaterally. So sometimes the only way to get at a problem is to make it bigger. So the model in my mind at the time when I wrote this piece back in 2002 was none other than Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. I know a lot of you were saying, who? Charles Evans Hughes was Secretary of State for Warren G. Harding and for Calvin Coolidge, all right? And everybody knows about the Washington Naval Conference in 1922 that limited, capital ships building and so on, but hardly anybody, unless you're an expert in the diplomacy of the history of the diplomacy of this part of the world, hardly anybody knows that one of the things that Charles Evans Hughes did as Secretary of State was he tried to clean up the detritus of the imperial mess that existed in the Pacific after World War I. So, for example, there had been German colonies, Marshall Islands, in Samoa, Marianas, what were the Allies, including the British, the French, and the Japanese? What were we going to do with these German territories? At Papua New Guinea, what were we going to do with all these German territories that took away from the Germans when they were defeated in the First World War? So what Charles Evans Hughes tried to do was he tried to do a kind of a multilateral arrangement where everyone, all the major powers, including the United States, would get something that they wanted to clean up the mess that was left over in the Pacific after the First World War. So that was the model in my mind. I thought it might be possible to make the problem bigger and solve aspects of it by including more countries that had equities in the Pacific. So my argument was to create basically a contact group, kind of an arrangement, and bring in the Russians and bring in the Japanese and, of course, the Chinese and South and North Korea and the United States, and maybe at the margins, depending on what kind of arrangements could be worked out, the European Union and possibly other interested actors who might play a role, and see if some sort of a concert arrangement couldn't be more effective in getting the North Koreans to behave themselves a little bit better. Again, I got letters from my friends in the government, people who are experts on this, and said, "Adam, great idea. It's totally impossible. It's too hard. Can't do it." And I actually had it kind of like laid out. For example, somebody has to get something. It's like a three-way trade in sports. Team A and Team B can't come up with a deal for this player and that player. But if they include Team C, then Team A can give a player to Team B, B to C, and C to A, and sometimes that works out to everyone's benefit. So what could the Russians get out of a multilateral arrangement over Korea? They might, just for example, they might get the rights to develop North Korea, extend Russian railroads into Korea. That would help the Russian Far Eastern economy. It would help the Korean economy. Be good for both sides. What would Japan get in return for this? That angle would be maybe a solution finally to the Second World War and the return of the Kuril Islands to Japan. China and Japan, maybe some arrangement over the Senkakus could be on the side. Once you get a lot of parties who want something around the same table in the same kind of negotiating environment, you get flexibility that you don't have in bilateral relations sometimes. So the hope was a series of trades could be made that would establish trust among the contact group, and then that could be brought to bear on the North Koreans. Okay, so nobody paid any attention to this suggestion, but what came out of the 1994 mess, where the United States was actually the 2002 after the 1994 mess, the 2002 mess, the enriched uranium crisis. What came out of it was the six-party talks, which I think most of you remember. And I want to again quote from Michael Green's book, because this is just precious what he has here. I love the way he puts it. And again, we can talk about it in more detail later if you want. So this is now Secretary Powell's in Beijing. It's February 2003. Okay. So he pitched the idea of these multilateral talks that turned into the six-party talks during travel to Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing in February 2003. The Japanese and the Koreans were enthusiastic, but Chinese President Jiang Zemin balked. Quote, "China is not associated with the North Korean nuclear program," close quote. Jiang Zemin said while chuckling dismissively to his assembled staff, and Michael Green was in the room when this happened. This is an eyewitness account of what happened, all right? "It's a problem for the United States and the DPRK to resolve among themselves," close quote. Powell explained the president's position that if this was to be done diplomatically, there would have to be a multilateral approach. After several rounds, Jiang suddenly recognized the coercive subtext of Powell's message. US forces were massing near Iraq at the time, and it would be clearly better for Beijing to work diplomacy with Powell than for Rumsfeld, that's Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. It would clearly be better for Beijing to work diplomacy with Powell than for Rumsfeld to pursue other courses. Quote, open quote, "I see," close quote, Jiang finally said soberly. And the next day, he ordered his foreign ministry to get to work organizing the talks, what became the six-party talks. "The charge that George W. Bush was unilateralist was wrong," writes Michael Green. "What he wanted with North Korean diplomacy was multilateralism." And I will add, since I know as much multilateralism as he could possibly get. That's how the six-party talks got started. But of course, it didn't work, did it? It really didn't work. In my view, just to conclude, in my view, US forces in South Korea, which were originally introduced and maintained in South Korea long after the Korean War as a tripwire to automatically engage the United States in case there were a second North Korean invasion of the South, whether with Soviet or Chinese assent or not, right, has turned essentially into a group of hostages. Those 38,000 soldiers and 200,000 other Americans who were there just, doing business like Americans and other types do business in Singapore, those have turned into hostages, all right? And what that means, given the fact that the South Korean government has a veto over de facto veto over American military activity, is that whenever the United States tries to threaten the North Koreans, when they do weird stuff, all right, all the North Koreans have to do is just flip the sunshine switch. Just go talk to the South Koreans, and the South Koreans have a laundry problem, and they tell us you can't do that. So in other words, American rhetorical policy with respect to the North Korean nuclear program is essentially in a kind of strategic political lockdown. The North Koreans take nothing we say seriously because all they have to do is get the South Koreans to undermine the rhetoric, and we can't do anything. This is an unacceptable spot for the United States to be in at a time when the continental United States is vulnerable, either already or in potential, to North Korean nuclear weapons on long-range missiles. This is unacceptable in my view. Now, it doesn't mean, I don't mean that the North Koreans are ever going to shoot a weapon at the United States. I mean, they might shoot a weapon at Japan, I don't know. They're not going to shoot a weapon at the United States unless they're suicidal, because the United States can turn all of North Korea into an irradiated ruin in about 2 hours. And they have to know that in Pyongyang. Nevertheless, it's not becoming of a great power, for its declaratory policy with respect to a state like North Korea to be undermined by what amount to American hostages on South Korean soil. Now, I'm not talking about revoking the US ROK treaty, not at all. And by the way, you don't have to even change one dot in the treaty to change this relationship of US ground forces in South Korea, because the treaty doesn't even mention ground forces, doesn't even mention them, okay? And I'm not talking about removing the nuclear umbrella over South Korea, and you don't need American troops on the ground for that umbrella to be credible. I'm not talking about anything like removing US air power in the region from being able to attack targets that are relevant to South Korea, not at all. I'm just talking about removing the ground forces. And I'm not talking about doing it abruptly. And of course, everybody knows South Korea can afford to defend itself on the ground. I'm not talking about removing them abruptly. I'm simply talking about thinking through the consequences of their being there essentially forever, because I really think that ultimately the North Korean regime, being so strange, is going to implode at some point. Nobody knows when. And I don't actually worry about the North Korean nuclear force growing, because I say they'll never use it unless they're suicidal. But a regime can be suicidal if it thinks it's going to fall anyway. It's against that moment of panic, of regime collapse crisis in North Korea, whenever it happens, if it happens, when it happens, that the threat of those weapons being used becomes real. And I think the United States needs to free up its rhetorical policy against the time that moment might happen. But it's a difficult process because it's inured. Troops have been there since 1950, all right? That needs to start now. What would the United States have to do in order to change the status quo and get those troops out of there, all right? It would have to, first of all, persuade the Japanese that this is in Japan's interest. And I think that would be hard. I know it would be hard, but it's not impossible. It would also have to build up U.S. relationships with other countries, aside from Japan, in the general region. That would include Vietnam, that would include India, if possible, to the extent possible, because it would not be a good idea if the optic of a U.S. withdrawal, a negotiated U.S. withdrawal from South Korea, would appear to be the United States running away from the region with its tail between its legs. That's an optic we can't afford. So this kind of change in policy would have to be very carefully discussed. There would have to be long consultations and understandings with all of America's allies in the region. But it seems to me that in the long run, it's better for the United States and all of its allies in East Asia and Southeast Asia too, including Singapore. It's better, all right, for the United States to put itself into a more sustainable posture for the long run than to maintain the frozen situation that exists now, which just stumbles from one failure and one futile attempt at diplomacy after another. So what I see here is basically a three-pronged way to restructure the American position in the Pacific, in Asia. One is to get those troops off of the mainland, get those U.S. troops out of South Korea. At the same time, build up and strengthen the posture of the United States diplomatically and militarily as necessary in the region as a whole. Okay, and be patient, right? I mean, the policy of the Obama administration was called strategic patience, which a lot of people parody to simply, we don't know what to do, so we're not going to do anything. That was unfair. All right, there is no quick fix to this problem. There is no quick fix. We have to be patient. All right. So a combination of changing the infrastructure of American credibility and reputation and being patient as it happens, that to me is a much better way to proceed than simply sitting, and doing nothing and just waiting for some kind of crisis to happen in Pyongyang. So I'll stop there. I know I've spoken a little longer than I was supposed to, but I'll stop there. And like I say, don't worry about this. If you don't like what I said, don't worry about it, because it's not going to happen. Thought experiment, just a thought experiment. Back to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Adam. I think you've given us a very comprehensive but succinct overview of what the United States approach to the Korean Peninsula is from the end of World War II all the way up to the contemporary era. So I already have a few questions from the chat box, and I guess I will go through them one by one, if that's okay with you. So
Sure.
The first question is, what will happen if the US military and the US public opinion, as expressed through US Congress, differ substantially on the future of US soldiers in South Korea, and the US president fails to take sides between the two of them?
So the question, let me see if I understand this. Are you suggesting that that Congress would essentially lobby for a withdrawal of U.S. forces, that Congress would refuse to pay for them? What would a
So like say if the military takes one position that they want to remain in South Korea, and Congress takes a different position, and
well, that's a very interesting question. I haven't actually thought about that because I think it's very improbable. The Department of Defense is part of the executive branch. The Congress will, from time, unless there's some kind of very strange reconstitution of the Congress is very reluctant to put constraints of that kind on the executive. The Congress typically defers to the executive in a case like that. So, I mean, there have been cases, with the War Powers Act, with the Church Committee, with refusing to allow the executive branch to defend South Vietnam in 1974-75, even though 3 American presidents had promised. So on rare crisis occasions, something like that, the Mansfield Amendment back in the day that wanted to withdraw U.S. forces from Europe. But these are mostly political demonstrations on the part of the Congress. I think Senator Mansfield at the time would have been very unhappy if he thought that might have actually happened. What he was just trying to do back in the day, and I think when this kind of thing happens, is to try to force the executive into renegotiating the terms of the deployment. Okay, the offset payments, the SOFA agreements, all the things that orbit U.S. treaty alliance relationships. But I find it really hard to imagine a situation in which the Congress would take a serious initiative against the will of the president to withdraw U.S. forces from South Korea. In my view, it should be the president. It should be the executive branch that takes the initiative. I could imagine Congress trying to block it. I could imagine the other side of a thing like that being more likely. But of course, anything could happen. It's true.
Thank you. That's a very interesting answer. So the second question would be, in your opinion, is the North Korean nuclear issue best handled by the United States in a bilateral format or a multilateral format?
Well, as I think I already suggested, the contact group format, the multilateral format, is the only format that has a chance, I think, to get anywhere. And the reason is because, if you have a negotiation, if you have contact between the two sides, and there's been lots of contact over the years at various levels, the idea is, you don't sit down with somebody. They don't sit down with us. We don't sit down with them unless you think, let me put it metaphorically. Each side has a peer, P-I-E-R, not P-E-E-R. Each side is a peer hoping to build a bridge. The way you build a bridge is you connect one peer to the other peer, right? So you're hoping you can find a way to bridge basic interests and in the process create some sort of trust. Well, that's never been in the offing. Really, never been in the offing. There's a great deal of, just trying to figure out what the North Koreans really want from the United States is not easy. And I think personally, again, remember that dim star on the peripheral vision in the night. I think a lot of Americans who don't understand when the North Koreans say to us that we want a guarantee of regime stability. In other words, we want to guarantee that you will not try, the United States will not try to overthrow or collapse the North Korean regime. I think that's often misunderstood. Obviously the North Koreans don't want the United States to try to undermine the regime, but there's an echo, there's a subtext that I think the United States misses sometimes, and that is, the Koreans like to describe themselves as a shrimp among the whales. People who understand Korea policy have heard that phrase many times. That's not actually accurate right now. Right now, there are two shrimps among the whales. There's North Korea and there's South Korea. And here's the thing. Everybody talks about reunification under this circumstance, that condition, and so forth. Nobody in the region wants a unified Korea. Not really. The only country whose interests are served by a unified Korea is the United States. Japanese don't want a unified Korea. China certainly doesn't want a unified Korea under circumstances that would leave Korea essentially a democracy spread out, even if it's a neutralized, non-nuclear a democracy spread out along China's border. Chinese don't want that. They'd much rather live with an erratic North Korean regime than have a unified, neutralized Korea, but a democracy along China's frontier. So nobody wants a unified Korea except the United States. But we can't get it. But we're not going to get anywhere by ourselves because there's no bridge to be built. They're just two peers, right? The other thing that's a problem is, so I was trying to get to, sometimes it seems to me that when the North Koreans tell us that they want a regime security guarantee, they want a U.S. guarantee against China. The North Koreans remember what happened in 1592, 1598. They remember the Hideyoshi Japanese invasion of Korea. They remember the Ming Dynasty coming to the supposed support of Korea in those days. And of course, nobody really knows what happened, but something like 1 million Koreans died in 7 years in that war. And the Chinese killed, if not as many, then nearly as many Koreans as the Japanese did. So the shrimp, the shrimp among the whales, I mean, that's the case in point of what happens when North Korea gets anviled upon, between, stronger neighbors. So, but the idea of the United States guaranteeing Pyongyang regime against China, that's a bridge way too far for the United States. Never in a million years is any American administration going to buy that. All right. And in the meantime, what do the North Koreans want, from us? They essentially want decoupling. They want the United States to, again, it's like what they said in 2002 to Jim Kelly. They want us to remove the nuclear umbrella. They want us to basically denuclearize the entire littoral. They want, for example, nuclear capable carrier-based aircraft to be withdrawn from being able to reach Korea, to be able to reach North Korea, right? We're not going to do that because that would trash the U.S. relationship with Japan, and that's the linchpin of American Asia strategy. We're not going to do that. So there's no bridge if it's bilateral. If it's multilateral, again, like I say, a series of trades can be made. And let me just. There are two ways to think about solving the North Korea. I mean, quite aside from regime change, there are two ways to think about solving the North Korea problem: the big way and the little way. The big way is some kind of an arrangement where the North Koreans are pressured into accepting reunification with South Korea under conditions of denuclearization guaranteed by all the powers, by the contact group. The US-ROK treaty would have to be renegotiated to a small gendarme police kind of thing that would be guaranteed to be far away from the Chinese-Korean border. One could imagine this kind of thing. And this arrangement would be guaranteed by all the powers and by the Security Council of the United Nations. All right? That's not going to happen. That'd be nice. That's just not going to happen. There are a lot of piers here, but there's no bridge. Right? That's not going to happen. But a much smaller way of thinking about making progress and getting out of the frozen situation that the thing is in now goes back to the recent summitry about which Singapore knows a good deal. So in September of 2018, the protagonists show up in Singapore, and what happens? To my surprise, I have to admit, to my surprise, a 4-part memorandum or statement came out of it that was not half bad. It was actually a basis, I thought, for some future work. But here's the problem: that summit was a photo op, as far as Donald Trump was concerned. Everything about so-called U.S. foreign policy, or what seems to be U.S. foreign policy, isn't really about foreign policy over the past 3.5 years. This is foreign policy used as a prop to issue domestic political signals inside the United States. In a normal administration, you get a 4-part memorandum like that. What do? You go home, you create working groups, you sit down and you try to flesh out what these statements mean so that when you meet again, you have something to talk about, okay? Something to talk about in private where something can actually happen. But when the American delegation came back, nothing happened. There were no working, nothing happened because it wasn't seriously about foreign policy to start with. But it could have been, which is why when the announcement was first made that Donald Trump wanted a summit with Kim Jong-un, all the Asia hands, all the experts, including my friend Michael Green, all right, the writer of the book, they were all aghast. They were horrified. What are you going to do? You're going to legitimate this guy by actually meeting him and shaking hands with him? And you're going to get nothing in return because he'll never give up his nukes. That's the ultima ratio. That's the low hole card, right? That the North Koreans will never give that up, right? So all you're doing is you're giving them a reputational freebie. You're going to get nothing in response. I thought that was wrong. I like the idea of a summit. I like the idea. 2 reasons, real quickly. One is every time the North Koreans, whether again it's the grandfather, the father, the son, whatever it is, the holy son, every time they act like lunatics, they do brinksmanship a la Richard Nixon, all right, and they try to extort or blackmail their neighbors or the United States, right? If you have a summit with the guy, if you humanize the guy, right, then it's much harder for him to act like a pariah. If you don't treat the guy like a pariah, he can't act like a pariah. And if he can't act like a pariah, he can't pull off this blackmail act successfully like they've done in the past. So, my idea was, give him the photo op, give him the handshake. I don't care. But what you're doing is you're undermining the theatrics, the histrionics of North Korean diplomacy. And also I have to admit, as a former speechwriter, as a recovering speechwriter, man, do I really envy North Korean speechwriters. They say the most incredible stuff. I never could have gotten away with saying stuff like that for Secretary Powell or Secretary Rice. Impossible, right? So I like the idea of a summit. And what's the end game there? What's the small success you can get? The small success you can get is the United States agrees to end the Korean War. We recognize the regime. We send some diplomats over there. We send a charge, if not an ambassador. We let the North Koreans send an embassy basically and stick it in Washington someplace. I think that's good for us and not for them. It exposes them to the real world, to not North Korea, right? And in return, right, we get some kind of a freeze on some aspects of the North Korean program. Maybe we persuade them not to test missiles and shoot them in the general direction of Japan. Maybe we get the UN or we get the IAE back in there again, which the IAE hasn't been there for a really long time. In other words, it's a half a loaf for a half a loaf. Okay, it would unfreeze the situation. It would unfreeze it. I would be in favor of that. And if you set as your goal the complete denuclearization of North Korea, then what you're saying is nothing will ever happen. What you're saying is all this is just futile. I would actually like to engage them, and I would be satisfied with I would be satisfied with a fourth of a loaf, all right, for a fourth of a loaf, compared to the situation right now, which is frozen and getting worse, and it's actually going to be one day, right, when the North Korean regime crisis comes, it's going to be dangerous for everybody. So that's my attitude toward that question.
I'm glad you brought in China and the rest of the region, because I think that segues nicely into the next question, which is, how do you think increasing Sino-US rivalry on the one hand, as well as the divergence between South Korea and the US on the other hand, would affect how the North Korean problem will be dealt with going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. If Donald Trump is reelected on November 3rd, then what we'll see is more photo ops probably. We'll see sort of more general incoherence. I mean, a complete lack of any kind of strategic thinking, except with respect to American domestic politics. So it's like a monkey in the machine room problem. It's very hard to predict how a monkey will act in a machine room. So if Trump is reelected, I can't tell you exactly what it'll look like. If Biden, he's the presumed Democratic candidate, if he's elected, and a Biden administration comes into existence after the 20th of January next year, that's different. Then they'll be right back in the same spot that they were in when Obama was president, when Clinton was president, and in between when George W. Bush was president. And again, my view is that unless they figure out a way to get around the frozen character of the problem right now as it continues to worsen with North Korean advances technologically, they're going to be right back in the same boat. Now, in the past, okay, there was an idea that China could be used to leverage the North Koreans. Given the exacerbation of the Sino-American rivalry in recent couple of years, first with the trade stuff, the tariffs and all that, and what's happened more recently, that's just off. That's out of the realm of possibility. There was never going to be any successful way of leveraging the Chinese anyhow, because I've already explained one reason why the Chinese wouldn't go for that, because they don't like the big solution. They don't find a neutralized, unified, denuclear unified Korea to be in their liking. I think the Chinese have a much different kind of long range ambition for Korea, which is basically to reunite it, but only under conditions that the Chinese prefer, which is basically to make it the kind of tributary state that it was 1,400 years ago. I think that's what the Chinese want to do, and they would be very, very patient. I mean, if it takes a century, that's what they want. They would only go for something like that if they could control the outcome. And as long as the United States is still strong in the Pacific, they can't entirely control the outcome. So I don't think that was going to happen anyway. And there's another reason. Just let me prattle on for a second. One reason that when the six power talks failed, when the contact group method failed, when the Chinese did not really leverage the North Koreans, when all that didn't work, one explanation for it that we didn't really think of too much, but I did, was the decoupling effect of a North Korean nuclear capability that could hit the continental United States. Now, of course, the Chinese could hit the United States with their own weapons, right? But for some reason, that doesn't seem to get our attention, because it's been there since what, 1969, 1970, whenever we were watching Lop Nor, from the sky, you could see what they were doing. But the idea of a slightly potentially berserk North Korean regime with nuclear weapons that could hit the United States, a lot of people thought, some people still think, that the advent of such a condition would decouple the United States from its nuclear guarantees to Japan and to South Korea and elsewhere in the region. And if you can get the United States to, to essentially decoupled, if the nuclear umbrella can be decoupled under duress from Japan, that's the end of the game. Because as I mentioned before, the U.S.-Japanese relationship is the linchpin of American strategy in the Pacific. But I never understood the argument. If the Chinese managed to use North Korea as a pawn or a proxy to decouple the United States from the protection of Japan, what would that lead to? That would lead to Japanese self-help. That would probably lead to Japan's simply taking a screwdriver, or two, and creating a nuclear weapon of its own, unhinged and unhitched from American strategic policy. How would that benefit China? How would an independent Japanese nuclear arsenal benefit China, right? It's not obvious that unless they believe in Kenneth Waltz's view that the more nuclear weapons, the better. And I don't think the Chinese think that. I don't think that. That's an idea that only an intellectual could come up with, really. So if that's a Chinese motive, using the North Koreans as a kind of a pawn to push decoupling, it's something that the Chinese have to use very, very carefully, let it eventually create a result that is deleterious to their interests. But that's something to think about. And that's something that people more expert than I am, by far, in this part of the world need to think about. Exactly the reasons why the Chinese, but obviously in a situation where Sino-American relations are poor, and I think they're liable to remain poor, even in a Biden era. I don't see any prospect for, and you can't really do a big multilateral deal without the Chinese. Can't, right? I don't see much prospect for anything working through. I say that regrettably.
What about the divergences between South Korea and the United States?
You see, that kind of depends on what government South Korea has. I mean, South Korea tends to flip back and forth. When they have a fairly conservative government, the alliance relationship is manageable. But when people like Kim Jong-un, Kim Dae-jung, and sort of the sunshine types win an election and get control, there's a lot of anti-Americanism embedded in that part of the South Korean political spectrum, and it makes it really hard for the United States to manage the relationship because, as I said before, South Korean politics and the South Korean political head, so to speak, is part of it abrades on what the United States can and cannot say and do credibly. It abrades on the orchestration of words and deeds from the perspective of the United States. So the United States is essentially trapped in, a kind of a three-way Korean political discussion. One axis of it is between South Korea and North Korea, but the other axis of it is within Korea, right? And then, as you point out, Sarah, there's the connection between the South Korean government and the relations that they carry on with Beijing. So this complicates everything and makes it extremely hard to get a clear line of sight on what a useful diplomacy would consist of. So that's one of the reasons why I want those troops out of South Korea. I want to escape this three-way political circumstance where, I mean, every couple of months, because an election in South Korea, everything like turned upside down, and you gotta go back and start from scratch to figure out just how to talk and act your way through it. I mean, it's a lot of trouble, and what do you get for it? What do you get for it? You look at the consequences of this policy, or you don't get anything but a headache, really. So that's getting out of the Korean political swirl. That's another reason why I want to get those troops out of there.
Since I think we are running a bit short on time, so I thought I would ask a final question to kind of hopefully bring everything together. The three-pronged way that you have set out seems to be a longer-term plan. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but in the short term, I mean, in the very immediate short term, given all the recent statements that has been going around from the US, from North Korea about negotiations and the potential for resumption of talks. So in the short term, what do you think the Trump administration should or can do to move forward the process?
Well, I don't think the Trump administration should do anything. I mean, between now and November is only a couple of months. And then if he loses until he's out of office on the 21st of January is not a long time. But the potential of the Trump administration to screw things up is not small. I don't worry so much about the Trump administration screwing up anything with North Korea. I worry about them screwing up something very seriously with China between now and the election or beyond the election. I mean, People are talking now all the time about a so-called new Cold War. And I've tried to explain on many occasions, both orally and in writing, why this is a dumb way to talk about it. The Cold War, the US-Soviet Cold War, had three basic characteristics. That, first of all, it was a big ideological element to it. The future moral paternity of the world was at stake, according to the two protagonists. It was an engagement between blocs, not individual countries. And it was an engagement in which there was very little economic equity involved on either side. The Soviets chose by design to be autarkic. Not one of those factors applies to the Sino-American. I call it a rivalry. We have a perfectly good word for it. It's a rivalry. Not one of those factors applies to the US-Chinese situation. Some people think there's an ideological element, by which they mean a predilection for authoritarian versus democratic government. But that's not, I don't think of that as an ideological issue. That's something that's deep in the culture of both countries. And where the country, we're bound to misunderstand or not like each other on the basis of that. But an ideology, by which an ideology in the narrow sense is, claiming paternity for the future, the moral future of the world. There's no Chinese design that I can see that wants to impose a Chinese way of governance on the planet. It's nothing like what the Soviet Union, claimed to want to do. So I think this is a misuse of the word ideology. So I just don't see that there's a Cold War. There's a rivalry, and the rivalry is heating up for largely on account of what the Chinese have done lately. I mean, just go down the list: Hong Kong, Ladakh. You go down the list in South China Sea. You just go down the list of the provocations that the Chinese have whipped up lately, and you ask yourself, is this coincidental? They're doing all this stuff at the same time. I mean, you would think if the Chinese were cautious about this, this would be a good time for a charm offensive, right? Instead, what you see is exactly the opposite of a charm offensive. And so you have on July 13th, just a couple of days ago, you have Secretary Pompeo getting up and, and basically it's an exercise in chest bumping with the Chinese, naming all these reefs and all these shoals and all these islands where you better not go. And I'm sure there'll be, more FONs, Freedom of Navigation acts on the part of the U.S. Navy between now and the election. I don't worry about anything happening with North Korea. I worry about not a Cold War. I worry about a hot war, an accidental hot war breaking out between now and January with China, not with North Korea. I mean, that's popcorn compared to the entree, seems to me. I mean, look, if Donald Trump wants to have another photo op with Kim Jong-un, I mean, maybe they'll meet in, I don't know, Cairo. Who knows? I'm all for that. All right. I'm for empty symmetry. I'm for making Kim Jong-un look less like a pariah. I'm for photo ops. I'm for totally pointless symmetry. That's okay. That doesn't bother me. If Donald Trump thinks that'll help him get reelected, fine. Let him get out of the country. That would be nice. But I don't. Nothing serious can happen. When you say short term, Sarah, you're really talking about, since we don't know when the North Korean regime's death knell will happen, self-inflicted, no doubt. We don't know when it'll happen. Short term is anything from 9 months to 9 years from now. Right? That's going to depend on context. That's going to depend on how things develop in a whole range of countries and places. That's going to depend on how South Korean politics evolve. It's impossible to predict that kind of thing, really. But yes, patience is necessary. Patience is not something Americans are good at generally, and it's something that we're terrible at lately for cultural reasons. But that's the ticket here. You need to prepare the best possible arrangement against the day when things get really icky and dangerous, that you need to be patient in the meantime and not do anything stupid. And by the way, the very same formula, in my view, we haven't talked about it really, except in passing at the beginning, the very same thing goes for Taiwan, okay? We have to keep that potential crisis from blowing up, and I mean that literally, all right? Because there is no bridge. There's no bridge. There are 2 piers or 3 piers, but there's no bridge there that I can see, right? So again, the beginning of wisdom is the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm. That means, for example, that if the Taiwanese government, the re-elected Taiwanese government, starts making independence noises, right? U.S. policy needs to be focused on stopping those noises, because that's a mistake, and that could cause things to get out of hand pretty quickly. Patience on all sides is necessary to prevent that kind of potential disaster from actually happening. So yes, patience. It sounds boring. It sounds like, you know what it sounds like? It sounds like full employment for diplomats. That's a good thing. Patience, full employment for diplomats. That's what we need, not full employment for diplomats. We need patience. We need patience.
On that somewhat optimistic note, I think I will bring this session to a close. Thanks very much, Adam. I would like to express our appreciation to you for your presentation and for your time. I would also like to say that it was really great having you at RSIS for the past year, and I wish you a safe trip home. And
thank you, Dr. Tao.
Thank you. On behalf of RSIS, I would like to thank everyone for their participation, and we hope to see you at our next RSIS webinar. I wish you everyone a good evening.